Do you constantly trip over your words and you end up editing for hours? Or do you feel like you sound really monotone and low energy? Or maybe you just want to sound more confident. All of these are common podcaster problems, right? And this episode has a solution for you. I'm going to be sharing 2 techniques that I've learned at journalism school and another one that I perfected during my radio days. And honestly, it all comes down to how you're scripting your podcast. And it's not so much like the flow and structure of the show. It's actually the words, how the script is positioned and how it's displayed. And so I'm going to be breaking down exactly how I'm using this, how I've used it in the past, and how I've helped clients get unstuck and just sound more confident. And this is not a vocal coach session. It's about actually writing and how information is displayed. So also another caveat. This week, I actually decided to do this episode as an audio only. And I know, I'm sorry. I do love doing video, but here at the podcast space, things are picking up. And I'm always telling you about how the important thing is the content, right? Like it's the messages that you're delivering value. And this week, I just couldn't get myself to create a whole video episode. I don't have enough time to edit a video podcast episode, to export, to add the episode twice. I just couldn't. Ironically, I was just talking to a fellow creator this week, talking about the importance of really investing in video podcasting and keeping at it, even though it is so much harder. So, oh, the irony. In case we haven't met, hello, I'm Anna Xavier. I'm a marketer for podcasters. I help podcasters understand what content they should be talking about in order to get to their goals. So if you're a small business owner or an impact-driven professional, this is the podcast for you. All right, let's get into this audio-only episode of the podcast space. Before we get into the meat of like the actual how to get it done, I want to address 2 things. Number 1, sounding great takes time and a lot of practice. And it's 100% doable for anyone who wants to improve their hosting style. But I feel like in the podcast industry, there's this misconception that, you talk all the time. So of course you should be sounding great all the time. And when I worked in radio a while ago, when I got out of journalism school, I remember I was doing this show that was Monday through Friday. It was the afternoon show. And I talked, from like 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. every day. I can't recall like the actual time slot. And this was like 2010, 2011. I cannot recall by now, but I remember there's a lot of talking that takes place. And great hosts, have years of practicing this. I think it's like, in order for you to be an expert at something, you're supposed to spend maybe 10,000 hours doing something. So, it does take time. So if all you're doing is recording 1 episode a week, it's 1 hour or, let's say an hour and a half. Like it isn't a lot. And looking at it from that perspective, you should be giving yourself some grace because it just takes a lot of practice, a lot of time. And again, let's be realistic. And then number 2 is also like addressing the big issue or, the root cause, because anxiety is actually sometimes what is making you trip over your words or just being afraid of not being enough, right? Like a lot of imposter syndrome comes from you just wanting to show up in the best light and you're not thinking that you're, good enough or what you have is good enough. And so you're maybe not wanting to quote unquote suck at something. And so basically you're trying to rush through the process. And so I want to just let you know that anxiety also like it's normal for podcast beginners. Trust me, like even when I'm interviewing my dream guests, I get nervous. And sometimes I'm like just like stumble over my words. But if we can start implementing some of these things on the regular basis, we're going to be spending less time editing and we're going to just sound more confident and also deepening our connection with the listener. So when you're looking at it, I want to remind you that you're learning a whole new skill set, right? And until you become what's called unconsciously competent at it, it will definitely take some adjusting to it, right? Like, so you're going to give yourself some grace and practice. And this is what's key, right? Like you have to practice your script through a few times. And I talked about this before, but I hear a lot of podcasters either like, especially, okay, this is like, we're getting a little sidetracked, But if you are struggling to say your own podcast name or like a specific line of your, like, let's say it's a tagline of your podcast, like maybe you really need to change the name of your podcast, or maybe you need to change the tagline, because if there, for whatever reason, you can't get to it, like maybe it's an articulation thing. And I'll give you some resources on if that's the kind of problem that you're having. But like really looking at script writing, that's one of the main things. If you're writing for a reader and you're not writing for yourself, you, the person who's going to speak the words, we're going to have a problem throughout the whole process, right? So practicing not only helps you understand the words that you're using. And so I want you to practice your rough script a few times in terms of flow. And so something that I also want to address is that if you're naturally a fast talker, like me, you're bound to say more mistakes or have more filler words. And so the way that you're scripting your own episode, that will help you kind of create better content because you're kind of like thinking about like yourself, right? So think about it. I am writing for myself. All right. And I do want to get into one tiny thing. I've shared this tip before, and that is you have to listen to your previous episodes, or you have to listen to the episode you just recorded. I know that so many of us feel really cringy when we are recording a podcast episode, especially if you have an editor just sending it out like, it'll be fine. Like you can't pick up your crutches, the words that you're using, or tics that you may have. Like it is important to listen back, because that's when you're going to be realizing what words you're struggling with. Maybe the connection isn't working, right? Maybe you're so nervous when you're recording the podcast episode that you have no recollection of the struggles you had. So listening to it yourself, it's super important to address those issues and move faster and learn faster, get better faster. So if anything, just tell yourself, this is so that it doesn't suck to listen to myself make a ton of mistakes all the time. Okay, end of side note. So the first tip really is about like looking into creating a script that works for you. And what that means is identifying your natural pauses. And that helps you, especially if you're trying to pause in specific times. And I'm going to explain how exactly you can pause and find out when you should be pausing, especially if your podcast is audio only and you're trying to read a script. So you need to be understanding when you're running out of breath. And that starts with how you're actually read the text. When I was reading the news, I would always justify the text to the left. And so I would read the text the first time and I would figure out like what wasn't working. Maybe the words were too complicated. Maybe the flow was too complicated. Maybe I had a line that was too long. So I just hit enter. And so I would, instead of having like a whole line that has, 20 words, it only has 7 or 3. Depends on where I naturally stop talking. It makes it so much easier to edit. And it also helps to give time for the listener to process what you're saying. I see that a lot of people, because the way that they're scripting the podcast is like go, 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 information overload, you are ending up overloading the listener too, and they don't have the time to put their thoughts together. And it's super important to let the listener think for a second about things. And it's totally fine to have a moment of silence. And when I'm talking about, pacing yourself more is also like when you're scripting the episode flow, make sure that you're giving examples. Make sure that you are taking the listener through a journey. I am terrible at this sometimes because I take you, as I just did, on a tangent. And you have no idea how much I edit out of the podcast because I'm like, oh my gosh, I thought of this amazing thing that I should tell you about. And then I'm looking at the time and I'm like, this episode is too long. And so I chop. I take so much out. So it's super important to, again, make time for the listener to take in what you said. And what that means is when you're structuring the information, include a few things where you're talking to the listener and ask them things like, have you noticed this? I challenge you, and I do this all the time, by the way. I ask you, like, have you thought about like this thing that I just did? Do you implement it in your podcast too? These are things that we can implement on our script so that we're not just talking about the same thing. We are combining like a lot of technical stuff that you have to be focused on, and a little bit more conversational stuff. And again, this podcast is very me. And this was done again intentionally. I didn't want to sound super scripted because I knew I will end up editing a ton. So I talk about how your content has to be imperfect. I cannot edit the perfect podcast because you're going to call me a hypocrite, right? And while I'm unconsciously competent at a lot of things, I want to make sure that this podcast is helping you see me as the host as I am. And this is one of the things that I hear all the time. People tell me, you sound exactly like you do on your Instagram stories, on your podcast, and in person. There's no difference, right? And this is what you want your listeners to think. You don't want to be the big guru who is like, untouchable. Like, you want to be approachable. You want your audience to be able to message you on Instagram, to message you via email, to reply to your newsletters, to comment on your posts on LinkedIn, or that they can follow along whatever you're saying, right? So that's why it's important to actually not be too scripted. Because in life, unless you're a really good speaker and you invested time and money into like public speaking classes and stuff like that, you're likely to not going to be that person, right? Like, you're going to make mistakes. And so that is actually a strength. And so when you're incorporating the language, right? Because there are some words that you will trip over. If you know when you're writing, like, remove them. Stop trying to sound fancy. Stop trying to sound smart or outsmart your audience. Use the words that you normally use. Because you're already thinking about so many different skills, we want to make sure that you get into autopilot mode, right? Okay, so going back. The first scripting technique that I was telling you about is when you align the text to the left. And again, I will include these in the show notes because if you're listening to this and you're struggling to understand, just make sure that you go to the show notes. I'll have a link to the website and you can see what I'm talking about. So basically what you're doing is, again, reading it through and seeing where you're naturally pausing. And that is where you will include a line break. And so in fact, this episode is an article that I never published about these like scripting techniques. I just had it in the back end of the website. And by the way, being clever about your content. I have a list of over 40 ideas for episodes. And this was one of mine that I was like, if I'm ever in a pinch, I am going to use this idea. So that's what I'm doing. So I basically took that article and I aligned the text to the left. And so before I hit record, I practiced it a few times. And it's all about looking through the text on the regular display and just adding line breaks when you either running out of breath or where you see that you may need to, like, for the next thought, just like gather your thoughts or it's a more complex idea. All right. Number 2. And this is when you'll have your script and you'll just add dots. The reason for this is that when you are reading, your eyes are moving faster than your mouth. So your brain is processing information faster than your mouth can say it. And by incorporating physical obstacles in your eyes, you are making sure that your brain is not getting ahead. And I remember when I was reading the news, we had like really short segments. And the journalist that I work with, sometimes she would give me her notes and she used the dots. And I was like, oh, wow, like this is really clever. Basically is where you need the breath. When you need to pause, you are making like dot, 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 dot. And that way you can't read what's coming up next. So you're not going to be making as many mistakes. Again, it does make sense when you're looking at this on the website. But honestly, I actually want to challenge you. Like, if you're listening to this episode, please, please, please come talk to me on Instagram and tell me if you ever done this and if you're going to be implementing these, because I think that there's just such a game changer because I use these techniques for years. And again, like, because obviously like some, I wouldn't call them like quote unquote trade secrets, but so many people have no idea. And to me, it's like, it's obvious, like you have to guide your eyes through the content that you wanted to read. But again, like if you were never told this before, of course you're going to struggle, right? So let's move into the last one. And so the last one is you're keeping the regular structure of the text, right? So basically you're not adding any line breaks, but what you're doing is you're actually incorporating the words that you want to accentuate, especially if you're someone who tends to either have like low energy, or if you're someone who's struggling with intonation and figuring out like how to just sound more exciting, right? So basically what you're doing is, and again, you always have to read it first. So give it a first pass, and then you're looking at like, okay, what do I want to really accentuate? And so what would you accentuate? You would accentuate the beginning of your show. You would accentuate like keywords that you want to make sure that people are listening. You want to make sure that you're like, if you are wanting to help them focus, you have the word like focus. Again, what do you want them to do and accentuate that word? Of course, you may say, what if I accentuate the wrong words? Well, when you're talking about something, you normally accentuate a specific word, right? So that's exactly the same thing. When you're talking, like what gives you excitement? I guess those are like really good exercises to think about. And so I want to remind you that like some of these techniques will take time. And I often get asked, I run out of breath. Well, the short answer is, listen to Nick Redmond's podcast, because she actually has a ton of resources about breathing. And I'm not going to pretend that I know. I'm going to send you her way. So I'm recapping because this episode, again, I want to make sure that you're actually following along. I want to remind you that there's two things that you always need to do. Number one, you have to use the words that you normally would use. Let's not overcomplicate it. And then number two, you actually have to practice the script before a couple of times, because that's like where you're figuring out the kinks, where you're running out of breath, and where you need to make adjustments. So let's get into the first one. The first one is you're going to align your text to the left, and you're going to run through the script. And whenever you're looking, and I'm kind of like looking here, and I'm going to have to say probably like 6 to 7 words. If you're a regular person, that's as far as you can get in a breath. So get to the 7. If it flows nicely, or if like you're in between a thought, get to that point, and then you hit line break or enter. And then you just go on to the next one. And so basically your text is going to look almost like as if it was poetry. Number 2 is you are giving the brain a physical obstacle to stop it from moving forward. So you're going to add dots, you're going to add lines, you're going to add a lot of a visual kind of element that stops you from moving forward. In my case, I used to use dots. And so just place those in either breathing, or again, same thought is just you're going to look at like train of thought. When that idea stops, you add more dots. And then last but not least, you're going to bolden or add bold to the words that you need to accentuate if you feel like you're one of these people that just kind of talks in a very flat way. It can also be when a new thought comes through, right? So again, I hope this episode is helpful. If it wasn't at all, let me know as well. I want your feedback. I would love to hear from you. And before I finish, you can always find the resources available, ways to work with me to help you grow your podcast on a one-on-one level. Just go to thepodcastspace.com. And for obviously everything related to the podcast space as a podcast, just add /podcast. And you'll have all the details about today's episode, for the formatting that I'm talking about, and of course, all previous episodes. I would love if you could rate and review the podcast and share it with a friend. Lately, we've been getting a lot of new listeners. We actually just broke, as we're recording right now, in the second week of November, 1,600 unique listeners, 1,620, I think, since the beginning of the year. It's crazy. So thank you again for being on that side. I appreciate you listening in every week and talking to me on Instagram, sharing your ahas and sharing your progress. I absolutely love to see your progress and telling me what you're trying this week and just your ahas and your wins. I'm here for you. All right. I've been Anna Xavier, and I'll see you on the next episode. Until then, keep creating content that's imperfect but moves you forward. Bye.